Daniel Harper's medals meant nothing when he saw Emma. Her wrists bound with string she couldn't have tied herself. The house smelled of ash, though no fire burned, and her whisper carried a warning. They're in the mirrors now. He glanced at the glass above the mantel, seeing not his reflection, but a crowd of faces, all wearing his scars. The war had followed him home. But it wasn't his to fight anymore, it was hers. The bus had left him a mile back on the county road, and the walk had been quieter than he remembered. No engines, no voices, only the sound of his boots breaking the brittle skin of frost that covered the dirt path. Daniel Harper kept his hands shoved deep into the pockets of his jacket, shoulders hunched against a wind that wasn't harsh, just empty. It was the kind of cold that didn't sting the skin, but seeped into bone. When the house came into view, the latch loose, as if no one had bothered to close it all the way in years. For a long moment he just stood there, watching his own breath gather and disappear. 2 years and change since his last deployment. 700-something days since he'd last heard his daughter's voice without static between them. He told himself all that time that there would be a moment when he stepped back into his life and it would fit again, that the door would open and the weight he carried overseas would finally slide off. But now, staring at the house, he felt nothing slide off. He felt only the ache in his knees, the way the straps of his pack had carved into his shoulders. He felt the dull throb of knowing that every letter, every promise, might not have been enough to hold this place together. He walked the last few yards slow, boots sinking slightly in the damp earth. The porch groaned when his weight met it. That sound, he remembered it. Nights sneaking out to smoke when Sarah was still alive, careful to step over the third board because it always squeaked louder. Now, every board gave him away. Daniel raised his hand and knocked 3 times. Firm, the way soldiers knock. The sound bounced inside the walls and came back thinner, as if the house itself had hollowed. He waited. No rush of footsteps, no muffled voice calling coming, just the wind worrying at the edge of the roof. He tried the handle. It turned under his palm too easily, and the door swung in with a reluctant sigh. The smell hit him first, not rot, not dirt, but the stale weight of a space left untended. Damp wood, old fabric, a hint of something sweet long gone sour. His boots sank into a rug that had once been soft. Light barely made it past the curtains, just thin blades slicing through the dim. He set the pack down near the doorway, careful, like dropping something fragile, even though nothing inside was. The sound of canvas against wood echoed too loud in the stillness. Photographs lined the shelf over the fireplace. He moved toward them without meaning to. His fingers brushed dust thick enough to write his name in. Sarah's smile behind glass. Emma's gap-toothed grin at 4 years old. Moments sealed in time, untouched by the days that had come after. The living room felt smaller than it used to. Or maybe he had grown too large in the spaces were carved inside him. That was the quiet in this house now. Not peace, but vacancy. His chest tightened with a familiar weight, the one that whispered late at night in the barracks. You left. You weren't here. And maybe no one waited. For a heartbeat, Daniel wanted to turn around, walk back down the porch, follow the road until it spat him out somewhere anonymous where no one knew his name. It would be easier than facing the truth carved into these walls. Then, faintly, from somewhere deeper in the house, a floorboard creaked. A small sound, almost shy. He held his breath. The urge to leave faltered, replaced by something thin and fragile pressing up through the dark like the first shoot of grass after winter. Daniel straightened, fingers curling over his knees. His voice stayed trapped in his throat, but inside the emptiness, something shifted. The house wasn't answering him, not yet. But it wasn't entirely silent either. And in that almost sound, that hairline crack in the quiet, he felt the first hint of something he hadn't dared carry home. Hope. The second knock didn't come from his hand, but from the house itself. A soft settling of wood, as if it had exhaled after holding its breath too long. Daniel stood, every muscle drawn tight, though nothing had moved except the air. He stepped deeper into the room. The hinges complained when he nudged the door fully open, a low, aching sound that filled the space like a voice and used to speaking. Pale light slipped in behind him, spilling across the worn rug, climbing the walls until it reached the far corner where a single chair sat facing the window. Empty. He hadn't expected a welcome. Not really, but the absence was louder than he could bear. A part of him, stubborn, childlike, had still clung to the image of footsteps rushing, of a small body slamming into him, of arms clutching his neck and a voice saying, "Daddy's home." Instead, there was dust on the windowsill and the faint trace of something once warm that had long since cooled. Daniel exhaled once, a long, steady release. His hand lingered on Emma's cheek before he looked up. "Take what you need." Diana's voice was quiet but held steel. "It's dangerous. For both of you." Daniel met her gaze without blinking. "She's my daughter. There's no choice here." They moved quickly after that. The nurses rolled a second bed into the room, setting it beside Emma's. Daniel lay back without protest, his hand stretching instinctively until it found hers again. The first prick of the needle barely registered. He kept his eyes on Emma. On the way, her small chest rose and fell, on the faint pulse at her throat. As the machine began its soft hum, drawing his blood, filtering, transferring life in a thin red line from him to her, Daniel felt a strange calm settle over him. It wasn't relief. Not yet. It was something older, deeper. The knowledge that every part of him, every scar, every breath, every drop of blood, belonged to her if it meant she would open her eyes again. He squeezed her hand gently, his voice a whisper that filled the sterile room like a promise. "If there's any part of me that can save you, you already have it." The monitors kept their steady rhythm. The world outside the glass walls stayed silent and waiting. Inside, Daniel Harper lay still, his blood flowing into the small body beside him, carrying with it everything he had left to give. The machine hummed in a low, steady rhythm, a sound that seemed to fill every corner of the quarantine room. Daniel lay still on the narrow bed, the line connecting him to Emma like a thin thread tying him to life itself. His hand hadn't left hers. Even with the needles, the sterile smell, the cold lights, all that mattered was the faint curve of her small fingers in his palm. Minutes stretched into something slower, on the slight tremor of her eyelids, the rise and fall of her chest that had grown so shallow it almost broke him to watch. Dr. Black moved quietly around the room, checking readings, murmuring orders to the nurses. Diana West stood near the door, her arms crossed, her gaze sharp but not cold. She watched Emma like someone who understood what was at stake far beyond the science of it. The color of Emma's skin shifted first. Not much, just a faint change. Almost reverently, Daniel let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. His vision blurred for a second before he blinked hard, anchoring himself back to her face. Emma stirred, just a fraction. Her lashes fluttered once, twice, and then her eyes opened. Not wide, not fully, but enough. Daniel froze. His lips parted, a sound caught in his throat. He leaned closer, the world narrowing to those faint, fragile eyes blinking up at him. Her voice came soft, a thin thread of sound. "Daddy." Daniel's chest cracked open. He swallowed hard, his forehead lowering until it nearly touched hers. "Yes, sweetheart. I'm right here." Her small hand shifted in his, a tiny squeeze, weak but deliberate. "It's quiet," she murmured. No more whispers. A tear slipped down Daniel's cheek before he even realized it. He let out a breath that sounded like a laugh broken in half. "Good," he whispered, brushing her hair back gently. "That's good." Dr. Black's voice was quiet behind him. "Transfer's working. Her body's responding." But Daniel barely heard it. All he could see was her face, her tired eyes softening as they focused on him. That faint, fragile spark that told him she was still in there, still his little girl. He kissed her forehead lightly, his lips lingering against her warm skin. "You're safe," he said, though his voice cracked on the word. "I've got you." Emma's eyes drifted closed again, exhaustion washing over him like a tide. But beneath it, something else bloomed, soft and sharp at once. Hope, small, trembling, but real. He closed his eyes briefly. Daniel Harper believed there might still be something worth coming home to. The days inside the quarantine wing passed in a muted blur, measured not by clocks but by the slow, steady rhythm of Emma's recovery. Each morning, Daniel would wake to the soft beep of the monitors, his hand still wrapped around hers. The thin scar of the transfusion on his own arm aching in quiet reminder. Emma's color returned gradually, like the faint wash of dawn over a dark horizon. The red marks on her skin faded first to pink, then to pale shadows that would eventually disappear. She still tired easily, her voice small when she spoke. But each word was a victory Daniel held on to like breath itself. Dr. Black moved through the room with his usual quiet precision. But even he couldn't hide the subtle shift in his expression each time he looked at her vitals. Diana West remained a steady presence, her calm voice delivering updates that sounded less clinical with every passing day. By the end of the week, the machines began to leave one by one. First the additional monitors, then the extra 4 lines. The room slowly transformed from a sterile cocoon of blinking lights back into something almost human. When they told him she could leave, Daniel didn't speak at first. He just sat in the chair beside her bed, his hand over hers, letting the words sink in. Outside these walls wasn't safety. Not yet, but it was life. It was a step out of the white hum and back into the world. They dressed her carefully in soft clothes, the fabric loose against her healing skin. Emma leaned into him as he lifted her, her small arms curling instinctively around his neck. The corridor felt different this time, less like a tunnel, more like a way forward. As they passed the sealed doors, Daniel's eyes caught briefly on his reflection in the glass. Tired, lined, but carrying something in his arms that mattered more than anything else. Outside, the air hit him first, cool, sharp, filled with the scent of trees and earth beyond the facility walls. He hadn't realized how much he missed it until it brushed against his face, and Emma stirred slightly, inhaling like she could feel it too. A black SUV waited near the gate. Diana opened the rear door, her voice quiet. "We've arranged a secure location, somewhere no one can reach her." Daniel settled into the back seat with Emma still pressed against him. She was light, but no longer weightless. There was life in the way she shifted. In the soft hum, she let out when he adjusted her blanket. As the car pulled away, the facility shrank in the rear window, a white box fading into the trees. Daniel watched it disappear without regret. Those walls had saved her life, but they weren't home. The road stretched ahead, winding through stretches of pine and empty fields. Emma stirred and opened her eyes briefly, her voice a soft murmur. "Where are we going?" Daniel kissed the top of her head, his voice gentle. "Somewhere safe. Just you and me for a while." Her small hand found his shirt, gripping the fabric lightly. "No more whispers?" He tightened his arms around her, his gaze fixed on the road unwinding before them. "No more whispers," he said, the words carrying the weight of a vow. The SUV moved steadily toward the horizon. For the first time in what felt like years, Daniel let himself breathe without counting the spaces between. The despair hadn't vanished, and the road ahead was far from clear, but as Emma's head rested against his chest and her breathing evened out, he knew one thing with a certainty that burned steady and quiet inside him. They were leaving the white walls behind, and they were doing it together. The safe house wasn't really a house in the traditional sense. It was a small, weathered cottage perched at the edge of the coastline, its wood siding faded to soft gray by salt and sun. When the SUV stopped at the narrow gravel drive, the sound of the ocean was the first thing Daniel heard. Not the roar of waves, but the steady hush of water breathing against the shore. He stepped out with Emma still in his arms, her weight warm against him. The air smelled of salt and pine, a sharp, clean scent that cut through the haze of antiseptic that had clung to them for days. The cottage door creaked when he opened it. Inside it was simple, a small kitchen with worn counters, 2 bedrooms with soft, uneven floors, curtains that fluttered faintly in the sea breeze slipping through a cracked window. Emma stirred slightly as he carried her to the smaller bedroom. The bed was low, the quilt faded but soft under his hands as he laid her down. She blinked up at him, her voice still small but steadier than before. "Is this ours?" Daniel knelt beside the bed, brushing a strand of hair from her face. "For now," he said gently, "just you and me." She gave a tiny nod, her fingers curling into the edge of the quilt. "It's quiet." Daniel glanced toward the open window where the sound of the ocean drifted in. "Yeah," he murmured. "Quiet's good." After she drifted off to sleep, he stepped outside, letting the screen door click softly behind him. The path led down a small hill to the water's edge. The sand was cool under his boots. The horizon stretched wide and empty. He stood there for a long time, the wind tugging at his jacket, the sound of the waves filling the spaces where words would have been. His hands curled briefly into fists at his sides, not in anger this time, but in something closer to resolve. Behind him, the cottage light glowed faintly in the dimming sky, a single warm square against the growing blue of evening. Inside that light, Emma was sleeping, safe, breathing. Daniel exhaled slowly, letting the salt air fill his lungs. He hadn't realized how much of himself had been locked in that house in Havenwood until now, until this stretch of open sky and water reminded him there was still space to breathe. When he returned to the cottage, the small bedroom was filled with the soft sound of Emma's even breathing. He sat at the edge of her bed for a moment, his hand resting lightly over hers on the quilt. For the first time since he'd come home, the weight pressing on his chest eased. Not gone, not forgotten, but lighter. He looked at her sleeping face, at the faint smile that had appeared there even in rest, and felt the quiet truth settle into him like the tide against the shore. They weren't just surviving anymore. They were beginning again. Morning came soft and pale over the water. The first light slipped through the thin curtains, brushing the walls of the small bedroom in gentle strokes. Daniel woke before Emma did, sitting in the worn chair beside her bed, his elbows resting on his knees. He hadn't really slept, only drifted in and out, his hand occasionally checking for the small rise and fall of her breathing. Emma stirred slightly, rolling onto her side. Her eyes opened halfway, hazy with sleep, but when they found him sitting there, something faint but powerful flickered in her expression. Safety. Recognition. The smallest spark of trust returning. "Morning, sweetheart," Daniel said softly, his voice carrying the roughness of someone who hadn't spoken in hours. She yawned, her voice still small but steadier. "Is the ocean still there?" Daniel smiled faintly and nodded toward the window. "Go listen." Emma slid off the bed slowly, her steps unsteady but sure. She padded to the window, pushing the curtain aside with her small fingers. The sound of waves slipped in immediately, the hush and pull of water meeting sand. She stood there for a moment, her shoulders relaxing, and whispered, "It's nice." Daniel walked over and crouched beside her. "Yeah, it is." He watched her take in the horizon with quiet wonder. After so many nights of whispers and fear, the simple sound of her breathing easy in a morning light felt almost holy. They spent the day in small, quiet moments. Daniel cooked oatmeal on the old stove, the steam rising into the cool kitchen air. Emma sat at the small table, her chin resting in her hands, watching him with a tired but content kind of curiosity. When he set the bowl in front of her, she smiled faintly. "Tastes better than the hospital food," she said between small spoonfuls. Daniel let out a soft laugh, the sound surprising even himself. Not hard to beat. In the afternoon, they walked down to the shore. The sand was cool and soft, and Emma's bare feet left small, delicate prints that the tide reached for but couldn't quite erase. She held his hand tightly, not out of fear this time, but out of something gentler. Connection. They sat on a driftwood log and watched the horizon together. The wind played with her hair, lifting strands across her face. Daniel tucked them behind her ear with the same quiet care he'd used to carry her out of that house. For a long time, they didn't speak. They didn't need to. The waves spoke enough, and the silence between them wasn't heavy anymore. It was healing. As the sun began to dip, casting gold across the water, Emma leaned against him, her small voice soft. "Are we going to stay here forever?" Daniel looked out at the endless stretch of ocean, then down at her. "For as long as you need," he said quietly. She gave a small nod, her fingers tightening on his sleeve. That night, as he tucked her into bed, Emma caught his hand before he could move away. "You're not leaving, right?" Daniel sat back down on the edge of the bed, brushing his thumb across her knuckles. "Not now. Not ever." Her eyes softened with something that looked like the beginning of peace. She whispered, "Okay," and drifted into sleep with his hand still in hers. Daniel sat there in the quiet, the sound of the ocean faint through the window, in the sound of waves, in the simple act of waking up to see her alive. And in that small house by the water, Daniel Harper began to learn how to live again. Days began to stack softly on top of each other, like the quiet layers of sand the tide left behind. The cottage settled around them, its creaks and drafts becoming familiar instead of foreign. Daniel found himself moving through the rooms with an ease he hadn't felt in years, the weight of vigilance loosening one notch at a time. Each morning, the ocean greeted them first. Emma would shuffle to the window in her oversized sweater, pulling the curtain back just enough to let the light slip in. "It's still there," she would whisper every time, as if the waves might have vanished in the night. Daniel would nod, standing behind her, letting the soft sound of her voice fold into the steady hush of water beyond. Breakfast became a small ritual. Oatmeal most days, sometimes eggs when he could manage to make them without burning the edges. Emma sat at the table, her feet not quite touching the floor, her spoon clinking gently against the bowl. Sometimes she would stop and crouch, picking up a shell or a smooth piece of driftwood. She rarely said much, just held her finds up for him to see, her eyes asking quietly if they were worth keeping. He always said yes. At night, the cottage took on a softer kind of quiet. Not the heavy silence of the Havenwood house, but something warmer. Emma would curl under the quilt, the salt air brushing through the cracked window. Daniel would sit in the worn chair beside her bed, sometimes reading from one of the old books left on the cottage shelf, sometimes just listening to her breathing. One evening, as he tucked the blanket around her shoulders, Emma spoke in a voice that was barely more than a breath. "It doesn't feel like they can find me here." Daniel sat down on the edge of the bed, his hand brushing her hair back gently. "They can't," he said, his voice steady. "No one can." She looked at him for a long moment, her small face serious in a way that made his chest ache. Then she nodded and closed her eyes, her fingers curling lightly into the quilt. Later that night, Daniel stepped outside. The moon cast a pale path across the water, the waves glinting faintly under its light. He stood barefoot in the cool sand, letting the sound fill him. The despair that had been his constant shadow since coming home had thinned here, not gone but softer, like the tide pulling back. He thought about how fragile everything still was, Emma's small body still healing, the questions that hadn't been answered, the people out there who had done this. But he also thought about the sound of her laughter earlier that day, when the cold water had caught her toes, the way her hand had felt warmer in his. Hope, he realized, wasn't loud. It didn't arrive like a flood. It came in whispers, in the soft clink of a spoon, in the way a child said, still there every morning, as if checking the world hadn't disappeared overnight. Daniel looked back at the small, glowing square of the bedroom window. Inside, Emma slept under the sound of waves instead of whispers. And for the first time, the thought of tomorrow didn't feel like a weight. It felt like a promise. Weeks slipped by like the soft retreat of the tide. The cottage became more than a safe house. It became a rhythm. Not a loud one. Not the kind of life Daniel had once imagined returning to, but something gentler. Something that held space for breath. The mornings always began with Emma's small footsteps padding across the wooden floor. She'd peek through the curtain before saying anything, as if she needed to confirm it all over again. "Still there," she'd whisper, and Daniel would answer from the kitchen, "Still there," the words carrying more weight than they looked on the surface. He cooked simple meals. They sat at the same small table. Sometimes they spoke, sometimes they didn't. It didn't matter. The silence here wasn't heavy. It was a kind of healing. Emma's strength returned in pieces. One day, she walked the length of the beach without stopping. Another day, she laughed. A small, surprised sound when a wave chased her back up the sand. Daniel froze when he heard it, that bright, fragile laugh, breaking something inside him he hadn't realized was still locked. He didn't say anything, just smiled at her in the fading light while the wind played with her hair. At night, the old chair beside her bed became his place. Sometimes he'd fall asleep there, his head tilted back, waking to the sound of her whispering his name just to make sure he was still near. Every time, he would take her hand and say softly, "I'm here." The cottage walls held their quiet life without demanding anything more. The salt air seeped into the wood, the soft sound of the ocean into their bones. Daniel began to notice small things again. The way Emma's hair caught the light when she sat by the window, the faint creak of the floorboards that somehow felt like home, the steady beat of his own heart when she leaned against him without fear. One evening, as the sun sank into the horizon, Emma handed him a small piece of driftwood she'd been carrying around for days. "For you," she said, her voice shy but steady. Daniel turned it over in his hand. It wasn't anything special, just a pale, smooth piece of wood shaped vaguely like a heart. But his throat tightened anyway. "Thank you," he said softly, brushing his thumb over its surface. Emma leaned against his side, watching the waves. "We can stay here forever, right?" Daniel looked out at the endless stretch of water, the cottage behind them glowing faintly in the dusk. He didn't have answers for the world outside, for what waited beyond this fragile piece. But he knew what he could promise now. "For as long as you need," he said. Emma nodded, her small hand finding his. They sat there until the light faded and the first stars appeared, the sound of the ocean steady and unbroken. Later that night, after tucking her in, Daniel lingered by the window. The The moon cast silver across the water, and for the first time in years, the weight in his chest didn't feel like something crushing him. It felt like something keeping him grounded. A quiet life was returning, not perfect, not untouched, but real. And as he turned back to see Emma asleep under the soft quilt, he realized that was enough. More than enough. The whispers were gone. The waves remained. And in that balance, Daniel Harper finally began to believe in tomorrow. The cottage had begun to feel untouchable, a small island where the world outside couldn't reach. Days had taken on their gentle shape. The ocean in the morning, quiet meals, Emma's slow, steady laughter returning like something delicate growing back into the light. But peace, Daniel knew, was never permanent. Not in his life. Not in the lives of men who carried too many ghosts. It was late afternoon when the knock came. 3 sharp raps against the old wood of the cottage door, cutting through the sound of the waves and the faint clink of spoons in the kitchen. Daniel froze mid-motion, the kettle's handle warm his hand. Emma looked up from the table, her wide eyes meeting his. The knock came again. Not frantic, not soft, just deliberate. Daniel's body moved before his mind caught up, old instinct waking like a muscle memory. He stepped to the door quietly, his shoulders tensing under the weight of the unknown. When he opened it, the wind slipped inside first, carrying salt air and the faint sound of gulls. And standing there, framed by the fading light, was a woman he hadn't seen since the day his world broke. Vanessa. Her hair was tied back the same way, though a few strands had come loose, whipped by the coastal wind. Her face looked thinner, harder, but the eyes were the same, a storm of something between regret and resolve. "Daniel," she said softly, her voice almost lost under the sound of the sea. For a moment, neither of them moved. Behind him, he heard the soft scrape of a chair as Emma stood, her small footsteps on the worn floor. Vanessa's eyes shifted, landing on the edge of the table where a child's hand gripped the wood. Her breath caught just slightly. "Emma." Daniel stepped into the doorway, blocking her view without meaning to. His voice was low, quiet, but carrying a weight that made the air between them tighten. "You shouldn't be here." "I know," she said. There was no fight in her tone, only something raw. "But I had to see her. Just once." The wind moved between them, carrying the smell of the sea and the faint warmth of the setting sun. Daniel studied her face, the lines of someone who'd made choices she couldn't take back. And for a moment the silence held all of it, the hurt, the betrayal, the faint thread of something that used to be trust. Behind him, Emma's voice came soft, uncertain. "Daddy? Who is it?" Daniel closed his eyes briefly. When he opened them, his voice had softened too, though it still held steel beneath. "Go back to the table, sweetheart." He didn't turn to see if she obeyed. His eyes stayed on Vanessa, on the way her hands twisted together as if she were holding onto something invisible. "I'm not here to fight," she said quietly, "or to take her. I needed to tell you. I'm sorry. For all of it." Daniel didn't answer right away. His hand rested on the doorframe, the rough wood grounding him. He thought of the vials under the floor, the marks on Emma's skin, the way she had whispered, no more whispers with tears on her cheeks. "Sorry doesn't undo what you did," he said finally, his voice quiet but steady. Vanessa's eyes dropped. "I know." For a moment, the only sound was the ocean. Then Daniel stepped back just slightly, enough to close the door between them with a soft, final click. He stood there a long time, his hand on the old wood, feeling the echo of the knock in his bones. Behind him, Emma's small voice broke the silence. "Was that a bad person?" Daniel turned, his eyes finding hers across the small kitchen. He knelt down, so they were level, brushing a loose strand of hair from her face. "It was someone who made bad choices," he said gently. Emma tilted her head, her brows drawing together in quiet thought. "Are they gone now?" Daniel glanced back at the door, the sound of the ocean filling the space between their words. "Yeah," he said softly. "They're gone." And for that night, at least, the cottage held its fragile peace a little tighter. Night pressed in gently around the cottage, the sound of the ocean softer now, almost like it knew the walls were holding something fragile inside. Daniel sat at the small table, his hands wrapped loosely around a mug gone cold. Emma had fallen asleep quickly, worn out from the day, her soft breathing filling the small bedroom down the hall. The knock still echoed in him, not the sound itself, but what it carried. Years of choices, of hurt, of something that could never quite be undone. He stared at the door, half expecting it to happen again, half praying it wouldn't. when the soft scrape of footsteps came outside on the gravel. He knew before the second knock landed. It was lighter this time, hesitant. Daniel opened the door slowly. Vanessa stood there again, her face caught between the porch light and the dark. The wind had picked up, carrying strands of her hair across her cheeks. "I shouldn't have come back," she said quietly, her voice almost swallowed by the sea. Daniel leaned against the frame, his hand steady on the rough wood. "You're right. You shouldn't have." For a moment they stood there, the air between them thick with everything they didn't say. Vanessa's eyes dropped to the ground, then lifted again, meeting his. "I didn't come to make excuses. I need you to know it wasn't supposed to happen like that. She wasn't supposed to get hurt." Her voice broke slightly on the last word. Daniel's jaw tightened, but his voice stayed even. "She's 8 years old. Hurt doesn't get undone because it wasn't supposed to happen." Vanessa swallowed hard, her fingers twisting together. "I know." She hesitated, then added, softer, "Is she okay?" He thought of Emma's small hand clutching his sleeve on the beach, of her whispering still there every morning like she needed to check the world hadn't vanished. He thought of the red marks fading slowly from her skin. "She's healing," Daniel said finally. The words felt heavy in his mouth. Vanessa closed her eyes briefly, and when she opened them, they were shining in the dim light. "Good." The wind moved between them, carrying the scent of salt and pine. Daniel straightened slightly. "You can't stay. Not here. Not now. She needs quiet. She needs safety. And you're part of what she's trying to leave behind." Vanessa nodded slowly, as if she'd known the answer before she asked. "I just needed to see her. Once. To know she was real outside of what I did to her." Daniel's voice softened without meaning to. "She's real, and she's mine to protect now." For a moment, something flickered across Vanessa's face. Grief, maybe, or something like it. Then she stepped back from the doorway, the gravel crunching under her heel. "Take care of her," she said, barely louder than the wind. Daniel's hand tightened on the frame. "Always." She lingered just a second longer, then turned, her figure fading into the dark beyond the porch light. Daniel closed the door slowly this time, letting the soft click settle into the quiet. He stood there for a long while listening to the ocean, to Emma's faint breathing down the hall, to the sound of his own heart still pounding harder than it should. When he finally moved to the bedroom, Emma stirred slightly as he tucked the quilt around her shoulders. Her eyes blinked open just a crack. "Was it the bad person again?" she whispered. Daniel sat down beside her, his hand brushing her hair gently. "It was someone who needed to say goodbye," he said softly. Emma's small fingers found his in the dim light. "Are they gone now?" Daniel looked at her for a long moment before nodding once. "Yeah, they're gone." Emma exhaled softly and drifted back into sleep. Daniel stayed there beside her, his hand resting over hers, the weight of words left unsaid, settling quiet and heavy inside him. Outside, the waves kept their steady rhythm, carrying the night forward one breath at a time. The morning came pale and slow, the light sliding through the thin curtains like it was hesitant to disturb the quiet. Daniel woke to the soft sound of the ocean and the small weight of Emma's hand still curled into his. She stirred just as he opened his eyes, blinking up at him with that same cautious awareness she'd carried since the first night he came home. "Daddy," she murmured, her voice still thick with sleep. Was it her? Daniel's breath caught in his chest. He hadn't said a name, hadn't offered details, but children knew. They always knew more than you wanted them to. He sat up slightly, brushing his thumb across her hairline. "Yeah," he said softly. It was her. Emma's gaze drifted to the window where the faint sound of waves bled through the glass. She didn't speak for a long moment. When she did, her voice was quiet but steady. "She didn't come in." "No," Daniel said gently. "She didn't." Emma's small fingers twisted into the edge of the quilt. "I thought if she came back, it would feel happy." Her brows knitted slightly, and when she looked at him, her eyes carried a weight far older than 8. It didn't. Daniel swallowed hard, his hand resting over hers. "Sometimes things don't come back the way we remember them." She thought about that for a moment, her little shoulders rising and falling with a breath that sounded too heavy for her frame. "Does that mean she doesn't love me?" The question hit Daniel like a sharp edge. He exhaled slowly, leaning down so his forehead touched hers, the morning light catching the soft strands of her hair. "No," he said quietly, each word deliberate. "It means she didn't know how to keep you safe. But I do." And I always will. Emma's eyes softened, a faint crease easing from her brow. She nodded once, a small, slow motion, and curled against his chest. Daniel held her there, his hand smoothing over her back, feeling the small, steady beat of her heart against his ribs. Later, they walked down to the shore. The air was cool, the sky still gray with the remnants of dawn. Emma held his hand tighter than usual, her small bare feet leaving prints side by side with his. At the edge of the water, she crouched down and let the waves kiss her toes. "Does the ocean forget things?" she asked suddenly, her voice a soft thread against the sound of the tide. Daniel knelt beside her, the damp sand cool under his knees. "Maybe it doesn't forget," he said after a pause. "Maybe it just knows how to carry things without letting them sink." Emma stared out at the horizon. He wrapped an arm around her small shoulders, pulling her gently against his side. "You already are, sweetheart." They sat there for a long while, the waves brushing against their ankles, the morning light slowly breaking open above them. Emma leaned her head against him, and for the first time since the knock on the door, Daniel felt the cottage behind them grow quiet again. Not heavy quiet, not fearful quiet, just the kind that held space for something fragile to keep growing. When they walked back up the narrow path to the cottage, Emma glanced once over her shoulder at the horizon, her voice a whisper. "Still there." Daniel squeezed her hand lightly. "Still there?" He echoed, the words carrying more than just the ocean, carrying them both. That evening, the cottage felt different. Not unsafe, not unsettled, but suspended, as if the air itself was holding its breath. Daniel sat on the small couch, Emma curled against his side under a quilt that smelled faintly of salt and old wood. The fire he'd built in the small hearth crackled softly, its warmth filling the room. Emma's voice came out quiet, almost thoughtful. "Daddy, if she comes back again, what will you do?" Daniel kept his eyes on the fire for a moment, the flicker of orange light painting shadows across the worn walls. "I'll do what keeps you safe," he said finally. His voice was soft but certain. "Does that mean I pick you instead?" The question hit him deep, in a place he didn't have words for. He leaned down, pressing a soft kiss to the crown of her head. "No," he said quietly. "It means you picked what felt safe. And right now, that's here, with me." Her small shoulders relaxed slightly at that. She exhaled a soft breath and curled closer into him. It wasn't a battlefield, but somehow it felt heavier than both. Because here, the enemy wasn't just outside, it was memory, trust, the fragile thread of safety they were trying to weave together day by day. When Emma drifted into sleep against his side, Daniel sat still for a long time, his hand resting lightly on her back. He could feel her breathing slow, steady, and it grounded him in a way nothing else could. Later, after carrying her to bed and tucking the quilt around her small frame, he stood at the window looking out at the dark stretch of ocean. The waves moved quietly under the moonlight, patient and endless. He thought of Emma's question again. "Does that mean I pick you instead?" The wind brushed against the cottage walls, gentle but constant, as if to answer him. Inside, the quiet held steady, and for the first time since the knock on the door, Daniel believed they might be able to keep it that way. The days that followed slipped into a rhythm so soft it almost felt fragile, as if one wrong step might shatter it. The ocean kept its steady voice outside the cottage walls, and inside, the sound of life returned in small, almost invisible ways. Emma began to hum sometimes, quiet little tunes with no words while she drew shapes on the fogged window or sifted through shells they'd collected on the shore. The first time Daniel heard it, he froze in the doorway, letting the sound sink into him like sunlight through cold water. It wasn't loud. It wasn't even happy in the way laughter was, but it was life. Every morning, she still pulled back the curtain and whispered, "Still there." And every morning, Daniel answered from wherever he stood, "Still there." The words had become more than a ritual now. They were a promise disguised as something simple. One afternoon, they sat together on the small porch, the wind carrying the salt air over the worn wood. Emma's legs dangled off the edge, her toes not quite reaching the ground. She held a piece of driftwood in her hands, turning it over slowly, her small fingers tracing its worn edges. "Daddy," she said suddenly, her voice soft but steady, "do you think we'll ever go back?" Daniel kept his eyes on the horizon for a long moment before answering. "Back where?" She shrugged one small shoulder. The other house. The town. Before. The word before hung between them, heavier than anything else she could have said. Daniel exhaled slowly, his gaze fixed on the slow roll of the waves. I don't know, he said finally. Sometimes going back isn't what we need. Emma turned the piece of wood over again, her brow furrowed in quiet thought. It doesn't feel like home anymore, she murmured. Daniel looked down at her then, at the small curve of her shoulders, the way the wind lifted a strand of her hair across her face. He brushed it back, gently, his fingers lingering for a second longer than necessary. That's okay, he said softly. Home can change. She nodded, her lips pressing into a small line. Maybe this is home now. Daniel's throat tightened, but he smiled faintly, letting his hand rest over hers where it gripped the driftwood. Maybe it is. That night, after Emma had fallen asleep under the soft weight of the quilt, Daniel sat in the chair beside her bed, the quiet of the cottage wrapping around him like a second skin. He thought of the knock on the door, of the life they'd left behind, of the pieces they were trying to gather here in this small space by the water. He reached over and brushed a loose strand of hair from Emma's forehead, his fingers light against her skin. We're still here, he whispered to the dim room, to the sound of waves beyond the window. To himself, outside, the ocean moved in its endless rhythm, patient and steady. Inside, the stillness held, not empty, but full of the fragile kind of peace that only comes after a storm. The cottage settled into its own kind of silence, not hollow like the Havenwood house, but layered, filled with the soft sound of waves, the creak of old wood, the faint hum of Emma's voice when she forgot to be afraid. Daniel began to realize that quiet could have more than one meaning. It could suffocate, but here it was beginning to heal. Each day unfolded with simple rituals. Morning light spilling across the kitchen table. Emma's small hands wrapped around a warm mug of cocoa. The soft scrape of her chair as she climbed up beside him to watch the oatmeal bubble. One afternoon, rain swept in from the sea, the windows blurred with soft streaks. The sound of the rain settling into his bones like something familiar. She looked over her shoulder at him suddenly, her eyes wide in that way children's eyes carry too much truth. Daddy, are we going to stay safe forever? The question hit him in a place words couldn't quite reach. He stood slowly, kneeling beside her, so they were level, the blanket pooling between them. I'll do everything I can, he said softly. Emma pressed her palm against the glass, leaving a small handprint amid the mist. Even when it gets loud again, Daniel covered her hand with his own. Daniel tightened his arm gently around her shoulders. Me too. In the distance, a lone gull cried out over the water, its voice carrying through the mist. Emma's eyes followed the sound, and she whispered, "It sounds free." Daniel swallowed hard, his hand smoothing over her small arm. Yeah, he said quietly. It does. Later that night, after Emma had fallen asleep, Daniel sat by the window, watching the last drops of rain slide down the glass. He thought of the weight she carried in her small body, of the way she had asked forever with so much hope and so much fear tangled together. He didn't have forever to give her. No one did. But he could give her this, a quiet place to rest, a safe hand to hold, and a promise whispered into the dark. When he finally stood to check on her, Emma stirred slightly under the quilt. Her lips moved in sleep, barely audible. Daniel leaned closer and caught the faintest words. Still there. He smiled softly, brushing her hair back. Still there, he echoed, his voice barely a breath. Outside, the sea kept its steady rhythm, a reminder that some things endure. Inside, the cottage walls held the fragile, growing shape of quiet, the kind that mends what's been broken without ever saying a word. The days stretched gently, no longer heavy with fear, but soft with repetition. Daniel found himself memorizing the small things, the way Emma's feet made almost no sound on the worn floorboards, the slight tilt of her head when she watched the horizon as if waiting for an answer only the ocean could give. One morning, she climbed onto the kitchen chair while he stirred oatmeal, her small elbows propped on the table. Daddy, she said suddenly, do you think the ocean knows our names? Daniel paused, the spoon resting mid-stir. Maybe, he said after a moment. It knows the sound of us being here. Emma smiled faintly, her fingers tracing circles on the wood grain. Then maybe it won't forget us when we leave. He didn't answer right away. They walked down to the shore. Emma's strength had grown. She no longer needed to stop halfway down the hill. The wind tugged at her hair, and she lifted her arms into it. laughing softly as if testing the air itself. At the edge of the water, she crouched and let the waves slide over her fingers. "It's cold," she said with a small giggle. Daniel crouched beside her, his hand brushing against hers in the shallow surf. "Cold means alive," he murmured. Emma looked up at him, her smile faint but certain. "We're alive." The words were simple. "Thank you," he said softly, his voice carrying more than the words themselves. Emma leaned against him as they sat on the porch, the sky painted in shades of fading gold. "We should keep all the shells," she murmured. "Then we'll remember the days." Daniel nodded, his arm wrapping gently around her small shoulders. "Yeah," he whispered, "we'll remember. That night." It wasn't just a piece of the ocean. It was proof that small hands could hold new days, that even chipped and weathered things could still carry beauty. Outside, the tide shifted softly under the stars, and Daniel Harper whispered to the dark, to the waves, to himself, "We're alive." It was the kind of evening that came quietly, slipping in with a soft wind and the faint scent of salt clinging to the air. Daniel sat on the porch steps with Emma tucked against his side, her small legs curled under the oversized sweater she'd claimed as her own. The sun had already slipped beneath the horizon, leaving the world washed in blue-gray light. Emma rested her head against his chest, her voice no louder than the sound of the waves. "It doesn't feel like they can find us here." Daniel's hand moved slowly through her hair, the strands soft against his fingers. "That's because they can't," he said gently. "Not here." She was quiet for a long moment, listening to the ocean. Then, in a voice almost uncertain, "Is this what safe sounds like?" Daniel swallowed, his eyes on the line where the sea met the fading sky. "Yeah," he murmured. "I think it is. They stayed like that." The small weight of trust against her chest. Later, back inside, Emma padded to her small bed and crawled under the quilt without him needing to tuck her in. She looked up at him as he sat in the old chair beside her. "Daddy." "Yes, sweetheart." Her fingers traced the edge of the quilt, her eyes blinking slow with sleep. "Or even the ocean," he said softly. "Safe is us. Wherever we are together, that's where it will be." Emma's small shoulders loosened, her breath evening out as her eyelids fluttered. "Okay." It was something you built every day in small ways, in quiet words, in gentle hands, in the promise to stay when everything else had left. Outside, the ocean kept its soft, endless voice. Inside, in the space between one breath and the next, Daniel Harper heard it too. The sound of safe. The morning broke pale, the kind of light that made everything feel softer, almost unfinished. Daniel sat at the small kitchen table long before Emma woke, a blank piece of paper in front of him and a pen resting loosely between his fingers. The cottage was quiet except for the faint hum of the sea through the walls. He hadn't written a letter in years. Out there in the desert and the dust, letters had been lifelines. Now, staring at the blank page, it felt heavier than any battlefield. He began without thinking, "Emma." The words that followed were slow, uneven. He wrote about the first time he held her. "You saved me as much as I saved you." By the time he stopped, the paper held more than ink. It held the quiet weight of everything they'd been through. Daniel turned, folding the paper instinctively before she could see. "Just writing," he said softly. She padded over, climbing onto the chair beside him, her hair a soft mess around her face. "A letter." "Yeah." "To who?" Daniel looked at her for a long moment before answering. "To you." Emma tilted her head, her small fingers brushing the folded edge. "Can I read it?" "Not yet," he said gently, slipping it into his pocket. "One day." She leaned against his arm, her voice quiet. "Okay, as long as you don't forget to give it to me." Daniel smiled faintly, kissing the top of her head. "I won't." Later that day, they walked the shoreline as the tide crept in, the waves brushing their ankles. Emma bent down to collect a small, broken shell and held it up to him. "It's not perfect," she said, "but it's still pretty." Daniel turned the shell over in his hand, feeling the edges worn smooth by time and water. "Yeah," he murmured. "It is." That night, after she fell asleep, he slipped the folded letter under the small shell on the windowsill. He didn't know when she would read it, or if he would ever have to explain the words inside. But it was there now, like the sound of the ocean outside, a quiet promise that some things, no matter how broken, could still be kept. The days had begun to feel softer, but the weight of what they'd carried didn't vanish. It lingered, quiet but heavy, like a shadow stretching behind every small step forward. Daniel felt it most in the still moments, when Emma's laughter would catch on the edge of silence, or when the sound of the waves reminded him how much they'd lost to reach this fragile piece. One evening, the wind picked up off the water, rattling the loose shutter by the bedroom window. Emma sat cross-legged on the floor, sorting through the shells they'd gathered over the past weeks. She held one up, pale and cracked down the center. "This one looks tired," she said softly. Daniel crouched beside her, the floor cool under his knees. "Yeah," he murmured. "Some things carry a lot before they wash up." Emma turned the shell over in her small hands. "Do you think it's sad?" He shook his head, brushing his thumb gently over the jagged edge. "No, I think it made it here. That's enough." She looked at him then, her brow furrowed slightly. "Like us." Daniel's throat tightened. He pulled her gently into his lap, her small frame curling easily against his chest. "Yeah," he whispered into her hair. "Exactly like us." That night, after she'd fallen asleep, Daniel sat in the chair beside her bed, the cracked shell resting on the windowsill next to the others. The moonlight spilled across the floor in soft silver lines, and he realized that healing didn't mean the weight disappeared. He meant it in a way that went deeper than survival. Because it wasn't just her life he had fought for. It was his own reason to keep breathing. Outside, the waves moved in their endless rhythm. Daniel and Emma were walking the narrow stretch of beach behind the cottage, their pockets already heavy with shells and smooth stones. Emma stopped suddenly, and she let out a sharp gasp that turned into something else, something Daniel hadn't heard in so long he almost didn't recognize it. She laughed, not the quick, startled sound she'd made before when the water surprised her, but a real laugh, full and light, the kind that carried beyond her small frame and into the open air. Daniel froze, the sound cutting through him in the best way something could hurt. He stood there, watching her tilt her head back slightly, the ocean breeze tangling her hair as she laughed again, softer this time, like she was testing it. He crouched beside her, his hand brushing a damp strand of hair from her face. "That's a good sound," he said quietly. Emma looked up at him, a faint smile still playing at her lips. "It feels warm," she said softly, almost surprised by her own words. Daniel wrapped an arm around her, pulling her gently against his chest. "Yeah," he murmured into her hair. "It does." They stayed there, letting the waves wash over their feet, the sound of her small giggles mingling with the steady hush of the tide. Daniel closed his eyes for a moment, letting the sound sink deep into him. Later, "It sounds like the ocean's laughing too," she said. Daniel smiled faintly, sitting across from her. "Maybe it's happy you finally joined in." That night, as she drifted off to sleep, the faint smile was still there, her lips curved even in rest. Daniel sat beside her bed, his hand resting over hers, and realized the cottage felt different now. The silence wasn't just healing. It was filling. He brushed his thumb gently over her fingers and whispered, "Keep that sound, sweetheart. Let's stay." Outside, the waves moved steady and endless, but inside for the first time, Daniel Harper heard something louder than the ocean. The sound of his daughter's laughter still lingering in the air. The days after that laughter felt different, like the air inside the cottage had shifted slightly, carrying something warmer. It wasn't loud. It wasn't sudden. But every morning when Emma whispered, still there at the window, the words held a faint curl of a smile at their edges. Daniel noticed it in her movements too. The way her steps on the old wooden floor had lost some of their hesitation. The way her small fingers no longer clutched his sleeve quite as tightly when they walked down to the water. One evening, as the sun folded itself into the horizon, painting the ocean in muted gold, Emma sat cross-legged on the porch with a box of shells they'd collected. She lined them up carefully, her small hands turning each one until they caught the fading light. When she came back out, she leaned against his side, her head fitting into the space beneath his chin like it had always belonged there. "Daddy," she said after a long moment, her voice quiet but certain, "I think I'm not scared all the way through anymore." Daniel's breath caught. He wrapped an arm around her small shoulders, his hand smoothing over her back as he whispered, "That's because you're strong." Emma tilted her face up to him. "No, she said softly. That's because we're together. The words settled into him like the last light of the day, soft and deep. He kissed the top of her head, his voice thick when he answered, yeah, together. That night, after she'd fallen asleep, Daniel stood by the window, looking at the small line of shells on the sill. The pale spiral caught the moonlight exactly as she'd hoped it would, glowing faintly in the dark. He rested his hand over the letter beneath it, feeling the quiet weight of everything they were building here, piece by piece. Outside, the waves kept their endless rhythm. Inside, the cottage held the sound of safe and the first fragile shape of light. Daniel Harper whispered into the quiet, a promise to the room, to the child sleeping under the soft quilt, to himself. We'll keep it. The cottage had become more than shelter now. It breathed with them, carried their days in its walls, held the soft sound of their footsteps and the quieter weight of their healing. Outside, the ocean kept its steady voice, as if promising that time could move without erasing. One morning the sky was a soft, clear blue, the kind that felt like a beginning. Emma stood at the window in her oversized sweater, pulling back the curtain the same way she had every day since they arrived. Still there, she whispered. But this time, when Daniel answered from the kitchen, her voice carried something new, a small, quiet certainty instead of a question. After breakfast, they walked down to the shore, the sand cool and smooth beneath their feet. Emma ran ahead a few steps, her laughter floating back on the wind. Daniel slowed, watching her small figure against the stretch of endless water. She turned suddenly, her hair whipping in the breeze, and ran back to him, grabbing his hand. Come on, she said, tugging with all the strength her little frame had. Daniel let her pull him, his boots sinking slightly into the sand. Where are we going? He asked, though his voice was soft, touched with a smile. Emma stopped at the edge of the waves, her toes sinking into the wet sand. She looked up at him, her eyes serious in a way that made his chest ache. I want to stand where the water starts, she said. Daniel crouched beside her, their hands still linked. The tide rolled in gently, brushing over their feet, cool and alive. Emma squeezed his fingers. Feels like tomorrow, she murmured. He looked out at the horizon, the endless line where sky met sea. Yeah, he said quietly. It does. They stayed there a long time, letting the waves wash over their feet, letting the silence speak for them. That evening, back at the cottage, Emma sat at the table with a scrap of paper and a stubby pencil. Daniel watched her tongue stick out slightly in concentration as she drew two small figures standing by the water, hand in hand. Above them, in careful letters, she wrote, "Here is safe." She held it up to him shyly. "For the wall," she said. Daniel took the paper gently, his throat tight. "For the wall," he echoed. He pinned it above the windowsill, just above the line of shells and the folded letter. The drawing fluttered slightly in the ocean breeze, slipping through the cracked window, catching the last light of the day. That night, as Emma slept, Daniel sat in the worn chair and looked at the small picture, at the shells, at the pale spiral glowing faintly in the moonlight. He reached over and brushed his hand gently over Emma's hair. "We made it," he whispered, not loud, not triumphant, just a quiet truth spoken into the dim room. Outside, the waves kept moving, patient and endless. Inside, the cottage held the soft shape of something that had once felt impossible. Tomorrow wasn't a wait anymore. It was a place waiting for them, just beyond the line where the water started. The ocean kept its rhythm long after the cottage lights went out, a quiet reminder that life carries on, even after storms. Inside, the air held the warmth of small things, a child's breath, the soft creak of old wood, the weight of two people who had chosen to stay when everything else had fallen away. Daniel sat by the window one last time that night, watching the pale line where sea met sky. Tomorrow was out there, waiting, not loud, not certain, but present. He looked over at Emma, curled under her quilt, her hands still reaching out in sleep as if to make sure the world wouldn't slip away again. He covered her fingers with his own and whispered, "We're here. We're safe." Sometimes healing doesn't come in grand gestures. Sometimes it's in the sound of waves you've heard 100 mornings, in the small voice whispering still there. Maybe it's a person. Maybe it's just the promise of tomorrow. Whatever shape it takes, leave a piece of it below so we can carry those small lights together. Daniel ran a hand down his face, felt the rasp of stubble, the thin tremor of exhaustion threading his bones. This was what coming back really looked like. No flags, no brass bands. Just a man standing in a room that didn't remember him the way he remembered it. He crossed to the window and tugged at the curtains. They resisted, fabric stiff with disuse, then gave way in a slow tear of sound. Light pooled reluctantly across the floor, revealing more of the room. A table with one chair pulled out. A mug left upside down on the counter as if someone had washed it and forgotten to set it right. Daniel's eyes caught on the hallway leading to the back of the house. Narrow, shadows thick. When Emma was a toddler chasing after Sarah's skirt through this same hall. That echo of memory cut sharper than any shrapnel ever had. Halfway down the hall, the air changed. Not colder, just denser. As if the walls leaned in to listen. A faint smell reached him. Soap and something faintly floral. Not the heavy perfume Sarah used to wear, but lighter, like a child's shampoo. He swallowed. At the end of the hallway, the kitchen door stood half shut. The thin edge of light beneath, it trembled, as if something on the other side moved. Daniel paused. His hand rose halfway to the knob, then stopped. There was no plan for this. No training manual. Just a man with nothing left in his pockets except the weight of wanting. He pushed gently. The door creaked open into a room that was both familiar and foreign. The kitchen had always been the heart of the house, the place where Sarah laughed loudest, where Emma first learned to stand holding onto the edge of the table. Now it smelled of boiled vegetables and a hint of mildew. And there, by the far counter, a small figure stood. Back turned, shoulders slightly hunched, a broom twice her height leaning against her hand. The sound of bristles brushing would paused mid-motion. Daniel's breath caught. He knew that shape instantly, though it had stretched taller, though the hair was longer and paler than he remembered. The world tilted on a single fragile axis. He opened his mouth, but no words came at first. When they did, they were soft enough to vanish if the air shifted. Emma. The girl froze. Slowly, she turned her head, eyes wide at first, then narrowing slightly as if afraid to trust what they saw. She didn't speak, didn't drop the broom, didn't run. Daniel stepped forward once. The floor creaked. Her fingers tightened around the broom handle, small knuckles blanching. There was something in her gaze that split him open, recognition, yes, but behind it a caution he had never seen in his little girl before. He wanted to close the distance in a single stride, to kneel and hold her, to tell her everything he hadn't been able to fit into letters. But his boots felt nailed to the ground. The air between them was thick, not with reunion, but with all the days he hadn't been here. For the first time since the bus left him on the county road, Daniel understood what war had really taken. Not just time, not just peace. It had stolen the bridge between him and this small, silent child. Somewhere in his chest, hope flickered again, thin but present. Because even in her caution, Emma hadn't turned away. She was still standing there, still looking at him. And that, after so much emptiness, was something to begin with. For a moment, Daniel didn't move. He was afraid if he did, the image in front of him might scatter like dust in sunlight. The kitchen seemed to shrink, pulling them both into a small, fragile bubble of air, where nothing existed but a man and a girl separated by years they could never get back. Emma's hair caught what little light leaked through the curtains, fine and pale, strands falling into her face. Her frame was thinner than he remembered. She had grown taller, yes, but in a way that looked stretched, as if the world had pulled her up too quickly without giving her anything to stand on. Daniel crouched slowly, his knees creaking, trying to bring himself down to her level. The old floorboard sighed under his weight, a small, tired sound that felt almost like an apology. He didn't speak again, not yet. He wanted to take her in, the curve of her shoulders, the way her small hand gripped that broom handle like it was something to hold on to in a storm. She didn't run to him. He had imagined that moment too many nights under foreign skies, the slam of little feet on wood, the sudden weight of her arms around his neck. Instead, Emma's feet stayed rooted to the kitchen tile. When her gaze flicked up and met his, something sharp and deep moved through him. Those eyes had Sarah's shape, but not her brightness. They were guarded, older than 8. He tried to smile. A small thing, the corners of his mouth tugging up just enough to feel like effort. Hey, he managed, the word nearly swallowed by the quiet. Emma's lips parted slightly, but no sound came. Her fingers adjusted on the broom handle, an unconscious movement, and that's when he saw it, the faint marks on her wrist where the sleeve of her nightgown had slipped. Tiny blotches, red and raised against pale skin. His breath hitched before he could stop it. Not from fear exactly, but from a sudden awareness of how much he didn't know. The instinct to ask burned on his tongue. But something in the way she tugged the sleeve back down, quick and almost embarrassed, made him swallow the question. Daniel stayed crouched, waiting for her to speak, to move, to give him any sign that he hadn't become a stranger in his own home. But Emma just stood there silent, her wide eyes flicking between him and the floor as if caught between wanting and not daring. The weight of those years hit him in full then, not as a memory, not as guilt, but as a living thing standing between them. 700 days, 700 nights, every one of them now etched into the space between a father and his daughter. He wanted to reach out, to bridge it with his hand, but his fingers stayed curled against his knee. You can't rush trust. You can't order love back into place. War had taught him that about men, about life. Now his own child was teaching it to him again. Behind them, the house held its breath. The faint hum of the refrigerator, the soft tap of something dripping into the sink. Life going on in the smallest sounds. Daniel let the quiet stretch, not as punishment, but as acknowledgement. Sometimes the first thing you offer someone isn't words, but space. Then Emma did something so small he almost missed it. Her grip on the broom loosened just a fraction. Her shoulders eased by the tiniest degree. She didn't step forward. She didn't speak. But her body told him, I see you. I'm not ready yet, but I see you. Daniel nodded once, a subtle bow of his head, and in that motion poured every apology, every promise, every mile he had carried her in his heart. He didn't realize until his knees started to ache how long they had been frozen there. Two people standing on opposite shores. The first fragile plank of a bridge barely laid between them. For the first time since stepping off that bus, the crushing sense of being utterly alone eased. Not gone, but eased. Because in Emma's cautious, silent stare, Daniel caught the faintest glimmer of what he hadn't dared hope for. A reason to keep trying. Daniel stayed low to the ground, his knees protesting, the old wood beneath him pressing its history into his bones. He had spent nights in trenches, weeks in rooms with no windows. But this, the space between him and the little girl in front of him, felt more impossible to cross than any battlefield. Emma's eyes shifted to the side, as if the air between them was too heavy to look through. Her hand slid the broom down slowly until its worn bristles touched the floor. She didn't let it go. Daniel noticed her other hand tug at the sleeve of her nightgown again, pulling it past her wrist as if to erase those red marks from sight. He wanted to speak, to tell her she didn't need to hide, that nothing she could show him would make him turn away. But the words didn't fit in this room yet. They would sound too big, too heavy, in a space that had grown used to whispers. The kitchen light flickered once and steadied. It cast a pale halo on Emma's hair, the strands catching and holding it like fine thread. Her face was thinner than the round-cheeked child in the photographs, still sitting on the mantel in the living room. Time had carved her gently, but it had carved her all the same. Daniel shifted, resting one hand on the floor for balance. The cool wood met his palm, grounding him. You've grown, he said softly, the words leaving him like a breath he didn't know he was holding. Emma's head dipped a fraction, almost a nod, almost nothing. A small movement, but enough to tell him she had heard. The broom squeaked against the tile as she adjusted her grip again. That sound, a domestic, ordinary sound, cut him deeper than any silence. It spoke of days lived without him, of mornings and nights strung together in this kitchen where his voice had been absent. Daniel swallowed. He had known war would take pieces of him. What he hadn't understood was how it would take pieces of her too, even without touching her. He eased back, lowering himself until he sat fully on the floor, cross-legged like he used to when Emma was little and they would build towers of blocks together. He didn't reach for her. He didn't ask her to come closer. He just settled in as if to say, I'm here. However long it takes, I'm here. For a long time, neither of them moved. The only sound was the faint hum of the refrigerator and the wind slipping thin fingers under the back door. Then Emma did something so quiet it almost wasn't a gesture at all. She shifted her weight, leaning a hair's breadth forward. Her small bare foot made the faintest scrape on the tile. Not a step, not even half of one. But Daniel felt it like sunlight breaking through a long, gray morning. He let his eyes close for a second, not to hide tears, though they pricked, sharp and sudden, but to hold the moment inside himself. When he opened them again, Emma was still there, still holding the broom like a shield, still wrapped in her own caution. But she hadn't turned away. And for a man who had walked through a door, convinced there might be nothing left for him here, that was more than enough to keep breathing. Daniel's gaze drifted to her hands, to the way she kept one arm tucked in protectively. Those red marks. The questions rose again, cold and urgent. But he pushed them back for now. There would be time to ask. Right now, what mattered was not frightening away the tiny spark in her eyes that said she hadn't given up on him completely. He leaned his back against the counter, let his shoulders touch the familiar wood, and released a slow breath. The kitchen, the house, the girl. It all felt like a thin thread stretched over a chasm. Fragile, breakable, but it was there. After 8 years of absence, Daniel Harper felt it settle inside him. The distance was real, the loss was heavy, but the bridge wasn't gone. It had just been waiting for him to lay the first piece. By the time the sun slipped fully behind the trees, the house had grown quieter still. Daniel sat alone in the living room, his back pressed into the old armchair that sagged more than he remembered. The air was cool and damp, carrying that faint smell of what left too long in shadow. He hadn't turned on many lights. It didn't feel right yet, flooding the space with brightness. This house seemed to need time to remember him. Outside, the wind scraped along the siding, carrying bits of dry leaves across the porch. Inside, every sound carried weight, the shift of the building settling. The muted creak of a pipe somewhere in the walls, the soft brush of fabric as Daniel adjusted his sleeve. He could see the edge of the hallway from where he sat. The kitchen light was off now. Emma had retreated upstairs hours earlier without a word, her small footsteps soft but deliberate on the wooden stairs. He had stayed in the chair long after, listening to the house reacquaint itself with having him inside. Daniel leaned forward, elbows on his knees, his hands clasped loosely, the skin rougher now than when he'd last held his daughter. He rubbed at a scar on his knuckle without thinking, a habit carried home from nights on deployment. The clock on the wall ticked in steady, hollow beats. It reminded him of watch shifts overseas, the way time could stretch and shrink, how a single second could feel like a mile when you were waiting for something you couldn't name. His eyes wandered over the room, the shelf with the photographs still wearing their layer of dust, the sofa draped in a faded blanket Sarah had loved, the corner near the window where Emma's toys had once piled high. Empty now, Daniel exhaled slowly. He hadn't expected joy right away, but he also hadn't expected this hollow weight pressing into his ribs. Coming home was supposed to feel like stepping into warmth, into safety. Instead, it felt like stepping into the echo of a life that had gone on without him. He tilted his head back and closed his eyes. The dark behind his lids was no different from the dim room. He could almost imagine he was still out there, in some nameless barracks, waiting for morning to come. The thought tightened something deep in his chest. A sound broke through the stillness. Faint. Upstairs. A soft creak of wood under small feet. Daniel opened his eyes, head turning slightly toward the staircase. The air shifted with it, a subtle awareness threading through him. Another sound followed, a muted sniffle. Then silence. Daniel's hand gripped the armrest without thinking. The instinct to move, to check, to protect, it surged through him like it always had in the field. But this wasn't enemy territory. This was his house, his daughter. He stood carefully, the chair giving a small sigh of relief as he left it. His boots were off. His socks made almost no sound against the rug. He moved to the foot of the stairs, every step deliberate. Halfway up, the sound came again. This time, softer, like someone trying not to be heard. A small voice, thin and muffled, floated down in pieces he almost missed. "Daddy, under the pillow, they talked to me." Daniel froze. His hand tightened around the railing. The words were barely more than breath, fragile and uncertain. But they cut through him sharper than any command barked over a radio. For a long moment, he didn't move. The hallway above him stretched into shadow. And in that space between the whisper and the silence, Daniel felt the weight of something he couldn't name pressing in from all sides. He started up the last few steps, slow, careful, as if the house itself might shatter under too much haste. The air on the second floor felt different, cooler, heavier, carrying the faintest trace of something chemical beneath the usual smell of dust and fabric. He reached the top and stood in the dimness, listening. Nothing now, just the long, steady beat of his own heart in his ears. Daniel moved toward the door he knew was hers. His hand hovered just above the knob. For a moment, he let it stay there, suspended in the quiet. This wasn't a battlefield, but it felt just as dangerous. Not for his life, but for something far more fragile. He drew a slow breath and pressed the latch down. The door eased open with a sound like a held breath releasing. The room beyond was dark, save for a sliver of moonlight brushing the edge of the bed. The shape of a small body curled beneath thin blankets. Daniel stepped inside, the floorboards soft under his weight. He didn't speak. Not yet. The quiet here was thick and alive. And breaking it too soon felt like a kind of violence. He stopped near the foot of the bed, letting his eyes adjust. Emma's shoulders rose and fell in shallow breaths. Her hair clung to her cheek, damp with either sweat or tears. Daniel's chest tightened. The house was silent again, but the whisper lingered in the air like smoke. Under the pillow, they could talk to me. Daniel knelt slowly, resting his hand lightly on the edge of the mattress. He didn't lift the pillow. Not yet. That would come later. For now, he simply sat there in the dim and listened to the sound of his daughter breathing, letting the weight of her small existence anchor him to something real in a night that suddenly felt unreal. Daniel stayed crouched at the side of the bed, his hand resting on the worn edge of the mattress. The faint rise and fall of Emma's chest steadied him in a way he hadn't expected. She looked so small beneath the thin blanket, as if the fabric itself was holding her together. His eyes moved to the pillow, its faded floral pattern familiar and strange all at once. He remembered Sarah sewing that case when Emma was barely 2, remembered Emma dragging it down the hall like a comfort object. Now, in the pale spill of moonlight, it looked heavier, as if it carried something more than feathers and fabric. The whisper clung to the air still. Under the pillow, they talked to me. Daniel reached out slowly, careful not to wake her. His fingers brushed a strand of hair from Emma's damp forehead. Her skin felt warmer than it should. She stirred slightly, a faint sound escaping her lips. And instinctively her small hand tugged the blanket tighter to her chin. He froze. Something about the movement felt defensive, protective, not of herself, but of whatever lived beneath that pillow. The room held its breath with him. No hum of a heater, no distant traffic from outside. Just the low tick of his own pulse in his ears and the soft sound of Emma breathing in shallow, uneven pulls. Daniel's hand hovered over the pillow now. He didn't lift it. Not yet. The soldier in him measured the moment the way he once measured doors before breaching. The weight of consequence behind the smallest action. Instead, he slid his hand to the edge of the mattress and leaned closer, close enough to hear the faint hiss of her exhale. "It's okay," he whispered, though he wasn't sure if the words were for her or for himself. Emma stirred again. A faint murmur left her lips, almost too soft to catch. Don't let them whisper anymore. Daniel felt something inside him splinter. Not crack violently, not shatter. Just a slow, deep fracture of the kind that doesn't make noise but leaves you hollow. He let his eyes sweep the room. The faint smell hit him again, a tang under the usual scent of fabric and dust. Not rot, not mildew, something chemical, metallic. His gaze landed on the corner of the bed frame, where the wood looked slightly warped, as if damp had crept in from below. His fingers curled into the blanket, a soft, unconscious grip. Whatever lived beneath that pillow wasn't just in Emma's dreams. He could feel it in the air, in the way the house seemed to lean away from this room, as if even the walls didn't want to hold what was here. Daniel eased back onto his heels, the floor whispering under his weight. He wanted to tear the pillow away, to expose whatever secret it held. But one look at Emma's fragile, sleeping form stopped him. She needed rest. She needed one more night where his hand on the mattress could be more important than whatever nightmare lay beneath it. He sat there for what felt like hours, his hand never leaving the edge of her bed. At some point, Emma's breathing evened out, a soft rhythm that lulled the air into something almost gentle. When he finally stood, his knees stiff and his back aching, he didn't leave the room. Instead, he dragged the old chair from the corner and placed it near the bed. He sat, arms crossed loosely, eyes fixed on the pillow. The moon shifted, casting new shadows across the floor. In the silence, Daniel made a promise without words, the kind only a father can make. Whatever waited under that pillow, whatever whispered to his daughter in the dark, it would face him next. Not her. As the night thinned toward morning, Daniel stayed there. a lone figure guarding a small bed in a quiet house, feeling both the crushing weight of despair and the first fragile stirrings of something he hadn't felt in years. Purpose. The gray edge of dawn crept into the room like a secret, softening the corners of the furniture and drawing thin lines of silver across the floorboards. Daniel hadn't slept. His body had folded into the chair sometime past midnight, but his eyes never fully closed. They stayed locked on the pillow, on the faint rise and fall of Emma's breathing beneath the blanket. His back ached. His neck had a tightness in it that came from hours of stillness. But he didn't move. Not until the first true slice of morning light brushed the pillowcase and revealed, just for a heartbeat, a shimmer of something wet along the seam. Daniel leaned forward slowly, his breath shallow. It wasn't sweat, not the dampness of a child's restless sleep. This was thicker, catching the light in a way that made his stomach knot. He slid his hand beneath the edge of the pillow, careful not to disturb Emma. His fingers met fabric first, soft and warm. Then something else. A faint vibration, almost imperceptible, like the hum of distant machinery buried under cotton. Daniel froze. The room seemed to tilt around that single sensation. Very carefully, he lifted one corner of the pillow, just enough for a sliver of light to sneak under. The sight made his breath catch. Tiny shapes, no bigger than grains of rice, moved in slow, deliberate patterns. They weren't the dull brown of ordinary pests. These glistened a deep red, their small bodies pulsing faintly as if carrying their own light. A bead of that same red fluid clung to the sheet, bright and unnatural against the faded fabric. Daniel lowered the pillow immediately, his hand trembling in the space between fear and fury. He sat back hard in the chair, his heart thudding a slow, heavy rhythm in his chest. For a moment, he couldn't move. He let the air fill his lungs in small, controlled breaths the way he used to before breaking a door overseas. But this wasn't a door. This was his daughter's bed. Emma stirred slightly, turning her face into the pillow. A faint sound escaped her, not quite a word, not quite a sigh. Daniel leaned forward again, his hand brushing her hair. "You're okay," he murmured, the words barely audible. They weren't a promise, not yet. They were a prayer. The light grew stronger with each passing minute, turning the room from gray to pale gold. With it came the heavy realization pressing into Daniel's chest. This house, this room, his daughter, they were carrying something he didn't yet understand. He sat back again, running a hand over his face. He had seen a lot of things that defied reason, had learned to hold fear at arm's length. But this was different. This was home. And home wasn't supposed to feel like this. The chair creaked under his weight as he leaned forward once more, elbows on his knees. His eyes locked on the pillow, on the secret it held, on the faintest smear of red, just visible at the edge. The soldier in him cataloged everything, the texture, the smell, the weight of the air in the room. But the father in him felt something deeper. A quiet, growing rage that something had dared to touch his child in the dark. As the sun finally cleared the horizon and the room filled with light, Daniel made another silent vow. Whatever this was, however deep it went, he would find the end of it. For the first time since stepping off that bus, his despair shifted into something else. Not hope yet, not fully, but purpose, a reason to keep moving, to keep breathing, to keep fighting for the small, fragile life still curled beneath that pillow. The morning light had sharpened into something clearer, cutting across the room in angled beams. Daniel sat perfectly still in the chair, his fingers pressed together loosely, his eyes fixed on the pillow as if willing it to give up its secret without his touch. Emma stirred, a soft rustle of fabric. Her lashes fluttered but didn't open. She shifted slightly, a small hand sliding free of the blanket. Daniel's gaze caught on the skin of her wrist again. Those red marks, faint but raw, tiny constellations etched into pale flesh. His chest tightened. He reached out and brushed his fingertips gently against her hand. Not enough to wake her, just enough to feel the fragile warmth of her pulse beneath the skin. She let out a soft sound, something between a sigh and a whimper, and turned her face toward the wall. Daniel drew a long breath and let it out slowly. Then he moved, with careful hands. He slipped his fingers under the edge of the pillow again, this time lifting it higher. Light spilled underneath, illuminating what he had only glimpsed in the dim gray of dawn. He froze. There, spread in a trembling, shifting carpet, were dozens, no, hundreds of the small red creatures. They moved in slow, deliberate waves, their tiny bodies swelling faintly as if drinking in the air itself. The sheet beneath them was damp in patches, streaked with that unnatural crimson fluid. It glistened in the morning light, bright and wrong, like a wound that wouldn't close. And wedged near the seam of the mattress, half hidden beneath the mass, something metallic caught the light. Daniel's stomach dropped. He reached carefully, fingers brushing past the pulsing swarm until they closed around the cool, thin barrel of a syringe. He drew it out slowly, his hand steady though his pulse thundered. The needle tip gleamed faintly, a bead of the same red liquid clinging stubbornly to the steel. For a moment he just stared at it, the weight of it heavy in his palm despite its smallness. In another life, another place, he had carried objects like this for survival. Here, it felt like betrayal distilled into glass and metal. He lowered the pillow gently back into place, covering the movement beneath it, covering the thing that had crept into his daughter's nights. His hand lingered there a moment, flat against the fabric, as if trying to will safety back into it. Daniel sat back in the chair, the syringe balanced carefully in his hand. The morning light reached his face now, tracing the deep lines around his eyes. He stared at the needle until it blurred, until all he saw was Emma's small hand tugging at her sleeve, hiding the marks, protecting a secret she never should have had carry. The weight of despair settled over him, thick and cold. He had come home believing he would reclaim something, his family, himself. Instead, he had stepped into a battlefield he didn't understand, one where the enemy hid under his daughter's pillow. A sound escaped him, low and rough, not quite a curse, not quite a prayer. He set the syringe gently on the nightstand, away from her reach, and leaned forward, resting his forehead briefly against the edge of the bed. The room smelled of morning now, dust, old fabric, and beneath it that faint metallic tang. He sat back again, rubbing his hands over his face, and felt the thin, stubborn thread of something else beneath the despair. It wasn't hope yet, not fully, but it was the same thing that had kept him alive in places where the sky burned and the earth shook. The knowledge that you don't turn away, not when someone needs you. Daniel looked at Emma, at the faint curve of her small back under the blanket, and at the pillow hiding its quiet horror. His jaw tightened. Whatever this was, it had chosen the wrong house. And the wrong father. By late morning, the house had shifted into a brittle kind of quiet. Emma had woken briefly, her eyes hazy, voice no louder than a whisper when she asked for water. Daniel had handed her the glass with steady hands that didn't feel steady at all. She drank 2 small sips, then turned her face back into the pillow, retreating into a sleep that looked too heavy for someone so small. Daniel left the room only when her breathing settled again. The syringe was wrapped carefully in a clean cloth and tucked into the side pocket of his pack. Every instinct in him screamed to move, to act, to tear apart the house until he found answers. But another part of him, the quieter, older part, knew he needed to see the world outside these walls first, to gauge the air, to listen. The back door stuck a little when he pushed it open, the wood swollen from years of damp. Outside, the yard was smaller than he remembered, the grass patchy, the fence leaning like tired shoulders. Beyond it, the narrow path that ran between the houses of Havenwood stretched quiet in both directions. A voice carried on the wind, warm and familiar. "Well, I'll be damned." Daniel turned. Mrs. Miller was there, bent over her roses, her hair now a shock of soft white instead of the gray streaks he remembered. She straightened slowly, hand braced on her hip, eyes squinting at him as if to make sure he wasn't a ghost. "Daniel Harper," she said, and her voice held the weight of decades of neighborly memory. "Back from the other side of the world." He managed a small nod, his voice rough. "Ma'am." She smiled, a little sadly. "You always were too polite." Her gaze drifted past him to the house. "Emma's still here. Sweet thing." Something in her tone snagged at him. He stepped closer to the fence, resting his forearms on the worn wood. "She doing okay?" Mrs. Miller hesitated, her gloved fingers brushing soil from a leaf. "She's quiet. Quieter than a child ought to be. I hear her sometimes at night, crying. Soft, like she doesn't want the walls to hear." Daniel's jaw tightened. He kept his face still. "At night?" he repeated. Mrs. Miller nodded once, then leaned closer as if sharing a secret. "And the packages, always the same. Small, square boxes, delivered at dawn or long after dark. Never the postman, never during the day. She takes them straight inside, Doesn't even glance around. She? Daniel asked softly, though he already knew. Vanessa, Mrs. Miller said, her voice dropping. You're well. The woman of the house now. She studied his face, something like sympathy in her eyes. You didn't know? Daniel shook his head once. The movement felt heavy. Mrs. Miller's hand settled on the top of the fence. Her old fingers curled over the splintered wood. It's not my business. But, Daniel, the way she carries those boxes like they hold something alive. Or dangerous. The wind picked up slightly, rattling the leaves. Daniel stared at the ground for a moment, his thoughts threading dark and quick. Then he lifted his eyes to hers and managed the faintest ghost of a smile. Thank you, ma'am. She nodded, though her gaze lingered on him as if she wanted to say more. But she didn't. She bent back to her roses, humming a thin tune under her breath. Daniel turned back toward the house, the weight of her words settling into him like stones dropped into deep water. Packages at night. A child crying soft enough not to wake the walls. At the back door, he paused, his hand on the frame. The yard was quiet again, except for the faint sound of Mrs. Miller's humming and the wind threading through the old fence. He stepped inside, closing the door gently behind him. The air of the house met him again, cool, dim, holding its secrets close. Upstairs, the floor creaked softly. Emma, shifting in her sleep, or maybe the house itself listening. Daniel set his hand on the banister and let the weight of the moment settle in his chest. Whatever this was, it wasn't just shadows under a pillow. It ran deeper, the kind of deep you only found when you started digging. And he was ready to dig until his fingers bled. The house was still when Daniel stepped back inside, the kind of stillness that made sound carry too far. His boots were off, left by the door, so his socks barely whispered against the old wood as he moved through the hallway. He paused halfway down, eyes on the narrow door at the end, the one that had always been closed even when Sarah was alive. Back then, it had been a storage room, a place for old coats and winter blankets. Now, it held a different weight, a different kind of silence behind it. Daniel reached the door and tried the knob. It resisted at first, stiff with disuse or caution. Then it gave with a muted click, and the door swung inward a fraction before stopping against something soft. He pushed gently. The resistance slid aside. A faint draft met him, carrying a smell unlike the rest of the house. Not the damp wood and fabric of lived-in spaces. This was sharper, clean in a way that wasn't natural here. Alcohol, paper, something chemical lingering faintly beneath. The room was neater than any other he had stepped into since coming home. No dust on the desk, no cobwebs in the corners. The curtains were half open, letting in a muted light that fell across rows of books stacked with precision. Daniel stepped inside slowly, scanning. The walls were lined with shelves, most of them filled with binders and technical volumes. Medical texts, biology, a few titles he recognized from the field hospitals overseas. He let his hand brush the edge of the desk. The wood was cool and smooth, polished by recent touch. He opened the first drawer. Pens, receipts, a stack of unpaid bills folded neatly together. The second drawer held more papers, all organized too well for chance. But it was the bottom drawer that caught his attention, locked with a small brass keyhole. Daniel crouched, running his thumb over the metal. He reached into his pack, pulled out the thin piece of steel he had carried for years, not for war, but for the stubborn locks of makeshift shelters and supply crates. The motion came back to him easily. A twist, a soft click. The drawer slid open an inch, and the smell hit him first, a faint metallic tang beneath the sterile air. Inside was a small stack of papers bound with a rubber band and a single external hard drive, its casing a deep, dark red. He lifted the papers first. The handwriting on them was rushed, uneven, as if written under pressure. Symbols, numbers, short phrases scrawled between diagrams of cells and chemical chains. One line caught him like a blow. Red serum. 8Y sample. Reaction stable at low dosage. Daniel stared at the words until they blurred. 8Y. 8 years. His mind supplied the rest without mercy. He set the papers down carefully and reached for the hard drive. It was cold in his hand, heavier than it should have been. On the side, a small label marked in neat print, property of BRS. He didn't know the initials, but his gut tightened the way it always did when something in the dark started to show its shape. Underneath the hard drive, a single photo lay face down. He picked it up slowly. Emma, no older than she was now. The picture had been folded once, hard enough to crease the paper, and a faint smear of something red clung to one corner, dried into the gloss. Daniel sat back on his heels, the photo trembling slightly in his fingers. The house was silent, but inside his chest something roared. Not loud, not violent, just a deep, steady surge of anger and fear braided so tightly they were indistinguishable. He placed the photo gently on the desk, smoothed the crease with his thumb as if that simple act could undo whatever had been done. When he stood, the air in the room felt different, thicker. He slid the drawer shut carefully, locked it again, and stepped back into the hallway. The house greeted him with the same dim quiet as before, but now it felt less like absence and more like a held breath. Daniel set his hand on the wall as he passed, fingers brushing the old paint. "I'll find it," he whispered to no one and to everything at once. Upstairs. A faint sound answered, a small shift on old wood. Emma turning in her sleep. He looked up toward her room and felt the weight of the syringe in his pack. The words on the paper burned into his mind. 8Y sample. Reaction stable. Whatever this was, it had found its way into his house, into his child. And Daniel Harper had no intention of letting it stay. The afternoon slipped away in a gray blur. Daniel moved through the house with the steady quiet of a man preparing for something he couldn't yet name. Every instinct from years in the field told him one thing: evidence. You can't fight what you can't prove. Emma had slept most of the day. When she did wake, her eyes barely opened, her voice soft as moth wings. "Daddy, you're still here." The words had cracked something deep in him, not from joy, but from the fragile way they carried relief, as if she wasn't used to anyone staying. By evening, the house was again cloaked in that strange, listening silence. Daniel stood in the hallway outside her room, the small black case in his hand. He hadn't planned to use this gear here, hadn't even thought he'd need it, but old habits had a way of keeping themselves ready. He eased the door open, the soft scrape of wood onward loud in his ears. Emma lay curled under the blanket, her hair a pale spill across the pillow. The pillow. He forced his gaze away, focusing instead on the corners of the ceiling, the angles of the room. The micro camera was no bigger than a coin. He mounted it in the shadow, where wall met ceiling, the movement slow, precise. Years of setting surveillance in places far less forgiving had made his hands steady even when his chest wasn't. Next came the audio recorder. He slid it gently under the bed frame, near the headboard where even whispers couldn't escape its reach. Emma stirred, a soft sound slipping from her throat. Daniel froze, crouched low beside the bed. She didn't wake. Her small hand shifted, fingers brushing the edge of the pillow, then falling still again. He straightened carefully, his knees cracking in the quiet. The last piece of gear, a small sensor for movement, he tucked into the corner near the closet. When it was done, he stepped back and let his eyes sweep the room. Nothing looked disturbed. The chair from last night still sat near the bed, the blanket still draped loosely over her small frame. Daniel backed out of the room and pulled the door nearly shut, leaving a sliver of space. Back in the living room, he set up the receiver. The small screen flickered, then resolved into the dim outline of Emma's bed. His own reflection ghosted in the glass for a moment before fading. He sat. He waited. The house seemed to fold inward as night settled in, the walls drawing closer with every tick of the clock. Around midnight, the sound came. Soft. Almost nothing. Footsteps on the upstairs floor, measured and deliberate. Daniel's hand tightened around the edge of the table. On the screen, a shadow appeared at Emma's doorway. It hovered for a breathless second, then slid inside. Daniel leaned forward, his chest barely rising with each breath. The figure moved to the bed with quiet precision. Not Emma. Taller. Shoulders narrow. Hair falling long against the faint light. Daniel's stomach turned cold. The shadow reached into a pocket and drew out something small and glinting. A thin hand pulled the blanket back from Emma's arm with the gentleness of habit. The object pressed against a wrist. A strip of tape followed, fastening it there. Then, as silently as it had come, the figure stepped back, the blanket drawn up again, the pillow smooth in a motion almost tender. Daniel's pulse roared in his ears. His hand hovered over the phone. The old soldier in him cataloged every detail, the height, the angle of the wrist. The way the figure moved, as though this act had been done many times before. When the shadow slipped out of the room and the hallway emptied into silence again, Daniel sat back hard in the chair. His fingers found the phone before he even thought. The number came out low and steady, the same way he had once called in coordinates. 911. What's your emergency? Daniel's eyes stayed locked on the screen where Emma slept, her small arm now wrapped in something she didn't understand. His voice came out quiet, controlled, but edged with steel. I need to report a child in danger. The words hung in the air as if the house itself had been waiting to hear them spoken. The dispatcher's voice had been calm, professional. Too calm for the way Daniel's pulse hammered in his ears as he gave the address, the description, the brief details he could force into words without letting them shake. There's a child, he had said, his voice low but steady, and someone is hurting her. I have proof. Now, the living room was a pocket of tense silence, lit only by the faint blue glow of the receiver screen. Upstairs, Emma hadn't stirred. The shadow of the figure who had stood over her bed might as well have still been in the house. Daniel could feel the echo of their presence in the walls, in the very air. The sirens came soft at first, a distant hum that barely threaded through the cold night air. Then louder, closer, until the faint pulse of red and blue washed briefly against the living room curtains. Daniel stood, his knees stiff, his hand automatically brushing the pocket where the syringe rested wrapped in cloth. The knock came sharp and controlled. He opened the door to find two officers, one older with a weathered face, one younger with eyes still too wide for the job. Their breath clouded in the chill as they stepped inside, the smell of cold air following them like a shadow. Mr. Harper? The older one asked. Daniel nodded once. His voice was gravel. Upstairs. I have footage. The younger officer's eyes flicked briefly over the room, cataloging. The older gave a small nod. Show us. Daniel led them to the small table where the receiver sat. His hand didn't tremble as he played the clip back, though his heart thudded with every second of it. The door opening, the shadow moving to the bed, the glint of metal, the tape fastening something to Emma's wrist. The younger officer leaned in, his mouth tightening. The older one stayed very still until the footage ended, and the screen returned to its quiet view of Emma sleeping. You said you had physical evidence? The older officer asked. Daniel crossed the room and returned with a cloth-wrapped syringe. He unfolded it carefully on the table, the metal catching the dim light. The younger one exhaled softly. Where did you find it? Under her pillow. Daniel's voice was low-clipped, same as whatever those things are crawling under there. The older officer exchanged a brief glance with his partner. Things? Daniel's jaw flexed. You'll see for yourself. But when they stepped into Emma's room, the house seemed to have swallowed its secret. The pillow lay soft and unassuming. The faint metallic tang in the air had thinned with the rising cold of early morning. Emma stirred once, letting out a soft sigh, her small hand brushing the edge of the blanket. The younger officer crouched, lifting the pillow gently while Daniel stood taut as wire. Nothing, just fabric and the faint indentation of a child's head. No shimmer of red, no pulsing movement. The older officer straightened slowly. His voice was calm, careful. Mr. Harper, there are no signs of harm on the child beyond minor irritation. No visible threat in the room. The video doesn't show a face. It's not enough to move forward with an arrest or removal tonight. Daniel's hands curled into fists at his sides. She whispered about them. She's marked up. You saw the needle. You saw the tape on her arm. We saw a tape. A shadow. We don't doubt you believe what you saw, the older one said evenly. But belief isn't grounds for a warrant. Not without more. The younger officer's eyes softened for a brief moment before he looked away. We'll file a report. Have child services take a look. Daniel stared at them both, the weight of helplessness pressing into his ribs until it was hard to breathe. When they left, the flash of red and blue fading into the night, the house seemed darker than before. Daniel closed the door slowly, his hand lingering on the frame as if holding it up. He stood there for a long time, the quiet pressing in. Upstairs, a soft, fragile sound drifted down, a whimper, then a faint murmur. Don't let them whisper. Daniel's eyes closed briefly. When they opened again, they were no longer filled with despair alone. The helplessness burned, yes, but beneath it, something harder began to take shape. If the law couldn't see the enemy, then he would. Alone, if he had to. He moved back to the receiver, his hand resting on the cool edge of the table. Outside, the wind rattled the porch. Inside, the house waited, holding its breath with him. Daniel sat, the syringe glinting faintly in the half-light beside him. and whispered into the dim room not as a soldier, but as a father. "You picked the wrong child." The house never really slept after the officers left. Daniel sat in the armchair until the first thin blue of dawn stretched across the horizon. His body ached with exhaustion, but his mind wouldn't let him close his eyes. Every creak of the walls sounded like a step on the stairs. Every shift of wind against the siding felt like the house breathing shallow, waiting. At 6, his phone buzzed. The sound was soft but sharp in the stillness. Daniel snatched it up, his thumb trembling over the screen. A single message. A name he hadn't seen in years. "Maya, sit tight. Sending a team. 2 hours." Maya. Captain Meyer. The one person left who knew what he was when the uniform was on, and who he was when it was off. Daniel stared at the words until they blurred, then shoved the phone into his pocket and stood. 2 hours stretched like a lifetime. He moved through the house on quiet feet, checking Emma every few minutes. She was still asleep. Her small body curled tight, the faint tape marks still visible on her wrist where the shadow had touched her. By the time the first car pulled up, Havenwood was still wrapped in morning fog. Daniel stepped onto the porch as the doors opened. The man who climbed out of the front was older, tall and narrow, his white hair catching the pale light. A leather case swung from his hand, steady and deliberate. Behind him, 2 figures in dark suits followed, their eyes scanning everything in quick, precise sweeps. "Jack Harper," the white-haired man asked, his voice even. "Daniel." Daniel corrected automatically, though his voice felt foreign in his throat. "Who are you?" "Dr. Simon Black," the man said, lifting his badge just enough for the light to catch the seal. He gestured to the 2 behind him, Agents Davis and Evans. "Captain Myers sent us." Daniel stepped aside without a word. The old soldier in him recognized the quiet efficiency of people who were used to walking into places they weren't supposed to be. "Where's the child?" Black asked as he crossed the threshold. "Upstairs. Room at the end of the hall." Daniel's voice was low, steady out of habit rather than calm. Black nodded once and started up the stairs. The agents followed. Daniel trailed behind, his hand brushing the banister as if steadying himself against the weight of what was about to be uncovered. Emma stirred when they entered the room, blinking groggily at the strangers. Daniel crossed quickly, kneeling beside her bed. "It's okay, sweetheart. They're here to help." Her small fingers curled into his sleeve automatically, the way they used to when thunder rolled through the hills at night. "Carry her downstairs," Black said softly. "We need to examine the room." Daniel scooped Emma up carefully, her head resting against his shoulder. She was light, too light. The thought pressed cold against his ribs. Downstairs, he settled onto the sofa with her still clinging to him. Her breath warmed the fabric of his shirt as her eyes drifted shut again. Upstairs, the sounds were soft but deliberate. The muted click of cases opening, the hum of a scanner, the faint scrape of wood. Daniel's grip tightened slightly around Emma with each noise. When Black emerged minutes later, his face was pale beneath its calm mask. The agents followed, their eyes sharper now, the quiet of people who had seen something they couldn't unsee. Daniel stood slowly, careful not to wake Emma. "What did you find?" Black's gaze met his, steady and grave. The weight of Emma in his arms suddenly feeling like the entire world. He nodded once. From upstairs, one of the agents called down, his voice tight. "Doctor, you need to see this." Black turned and climbed the stairs again. Daniel followed, Emma still clinging to him. In the corner of the room, a section of the floorboards had been lifted. Beneath it, in a clean, precise cavity, sat several small glass vials, each one filled with a dark red fluid, each one labeled in a neat, narrow hand. "E. Harper." Daniel's knees nearly gave. He tightened his hold on Emma, pulling her close until her small heartbeat pressed against his chest. The room was silent except for the faint clink of glass as Black lifted one vial into the light. The liquid inside caught the morning sun, a deep, unnatural red. Daniel's voice was low, almost a growl. "You move her. Now." Black didn't argue. He snapped the case shut and signaled to the agents. The quiet of the house shattered under the rush of movement. The team outside bringing in containment suits, the low murmur of orders exchanged. Daniel carried Emma through it all, his arms steady, his jaw tight. For the first time since coming home, he felt something sharp and clear burn through the despair. This wasn't over. But now, finally, it had a name. The sound of boots on old wood filled the hallway, a rhythm Daniel recognized from another life. Swift, purposeful, the cadence of train movement. The Federal team moved like water, flowing through the narrow space with a precision that made the house feel even smaller. Emma stirred faintly in his arms as the first white-suited figures entered. Their respirators hissed softly, the fabric of their suits brushing against the door frames as they stepped into her room. The contrast was jarring. This little house that smelled of dust and memories, and these sterile ghosts moving through it like they were crossing into a wound. Dr. Black met Daniel's eyes, his voice low but firm. "Harper, we'll take her to a secure medical unit." Black gave a single nod. "Then you ride with her. But we move now." The agents laid out a clear path through the house. One of them sealed Emma's room behind a sheet of plastic, the sound of tape ripping loud in the silence. Another marked the doorframe with a bright red warning tag. As they stepped onto the porch, the fog had thinned, but the world still felt muted, like it hadn't fully woken. The convoy waiting outside was stark against the soft morning light. 2 unmarked vans, a small ambulance, a line of people in white moving between them with quiet urgency. Daniel descended the steps slowly, every motion deliberate. Emma was light in his arms, too light. Her fingers twitched faintly against his shirt, then stilled. The back of the ambulance yawned open, sterile white inside. Daniel climbed in without waiting for permission, settling onto the narrow bench with Emma still pressed against him. A medic in a sealed suit moved to take her vitals, the gentle beeping of monitors filling the small space. As the doors shut, the world narrowed to the hum of the engine and the soft hiss of filtered air. Daniel looked down at Emma's face, pale, her lashes dark smudges against her skin. The tape mark on her wrist was still faintly visible, a small, cruel brand. His hand cupped the back of her head, thumb brushing her hairline. "I've got you," he murmured, the words more breath than voice. "You're not alone." The convoy moved. Through the small window, Daniel caught a last glimpse of the house. The porch, the old siding, the second-story window of Emma's room, now sealed behind plastic. He held the image until it blurred. Dr. Black sat opposite him, his leather case balanced on his knees. His eyes weren't cold, just measured. "You need to prepare yourself," he said quietly over the hum of the engine. "Whatever this is, it's not small, and it's not new." Daniel didn't answer. His hand stayed on Emma's back, feeling the slow, uneven rise and fall of her breath. The words burned in his chest, but stayed there. "I don't care how big it is. It's not touching her again." The ambulance jolted slightly as it left the town road for the main highway. The medic adjusted a strap on Emma's monitor, his movements efficient but gentle. The steady beep of her heart rate filled the silence, a fragile metronome holding the moment together. For the first time in days, Daniel let his shoulders drop slightly. Not in relief, not yet, but in something closer to resolve. The despair that had clung to him since stepping off that bus hadn't vanished, but it had changed shape. It was no longer a weight pressing him down. It was a fire being stoked. He bent his head, his lips brushing the crown of Emma's hair, and whispered what sounded almost like a prayer, though he hadn't said one in years. "You're coming back to me, no matter what it takes." Outside, the fog began to thin. Ahead, the road stretched long and pale into the waiting day. The facility wasn't a hospital in the way Daniel remembered hospitals. There were no bustling corridors filled with voices, no faint smell of cafeteria coffee drifting through the air. This place was quiet, clinical, its walls a pale white that seemed designed to erase memory. The ambulance doors opened to a gust of sterile air. The team moved fast, their voices low and clipped, the soft squeak of rubber soles echoing against the smooth floors. Daniel stepped down with Emma still in his arms, ignoring the stretcher when the medics wheeled forward. "I'm carrying her," he said, and no one argued. The corridor stretched long and empty, lined with glass doors that sealed shut with faint mechanical sighs. It was spotless, the bed in the center too crisp, too cold. Machines lined the walls, their screens blinking in quiet readiness. Daniel laid Emma down as gently as if she were made of glass. "We're starting her on a full panel. Blood, tissue, everything. We need to know what they took from her and what they left behind." Daniel's jaw tightened. "And if you find something?" Black's gaze met his. "Then we find a way to undo it." The nurses worked with quiet efficiency, placing 4 lines, attaching small electrodes to Emma's chest. Only murmured something soft and broken. Daddy, no more whispers. Daniel leaned down, brushing his thumb across her damp temple. No more, he said. The words heavy with a promise he wasn't sure how to keep yet. The machines hummed. The room smelled faintly of antiseptic and something sharper. Fear, maybe, or the ghost of what had been hiding under her pillow. Dr. Black stepped aside as another figure entered. A woman tall, with short black hair and eyes that scanned the room like she'd been trained to see everything at once. She extended a hand briefly. Diana West, Bioresponse Unit. Daniel took it automatically, though his grip was tighter than it should have been. What's happening to her? Diana's gaze lingered on Emma before meeting his. She's been exposed to a synthetic organism, engineered to extract and store specific biological markers. Likely antibodies, possibly more. Daniel swallowed hard, his hand finding Emma's small one on the sheet. Her fingers were cool but twitched faintly under his touch. You're saying someone's been taking pieces of her? Not just taking, Diana said quietly. Studying, harvesting. The word felt like a physical blow. Daniel closed his eyes for a heartbeat, then opened them, his voice low and steady. Fix her, whatever it takes. Diana nodded once. That's the plan. The room fell into a strange rhythm then. The soft beep of monitors, the faint clink of instruments, Emma's shallow breathing. Daniel didn't move from his spot, his hand never leaving hers. The despair that had wrapped around him for days was still there, but something else had begun to grow beneath it. Not hope, not yet. Something rougher, sharper. The same thing that had carried him through nights when the world felt like it was ending. He looked down at Emma, at the small rise and fall of her chest, and felt the words form inside him. Solid and certain, you're not alone. Not anymore. Outside the sealed glass door, the corridor stretched silent and white. Inside, Daniel Harper sat beside his daughter's bed, his hand wrapped around hers like an anchor, refusing to let the world pull her away. The hours bled together inside the white walls. Time felt stripped of its edges, turning into one long breath held too tight. Daniel hadn't moved from the chair beside Emma's bed. His hand stayed wrapped gently around hers, his thumb tracing small, unconscious circles over the cool skin of her knuckles. The steady beep of the monitor was the only sound that kept him grounded. Every soft tone was a reminder she was still here. Every pause between beeps felt like the cliff edge of a nightmare. Her skin looked paler now under the harsh lights, the faint marks on her wrists and neck standing out like bruises from something unseen, the red too bright under her veins. Daniel felt the weight of it pressing into his chest with every slow inhale she took. Dr. Black returned with a small tray of vials. He didn't speak right away, just glanced at the monitors and then at Daniel. Her blood shows a high concentration of the synthetic enzyme. It's spreading faster than expected. Daniel's grip tightened slightly around Emma's hand. What does that mean? Black's voice stayed even, but the set of his jaw betrayed him. Her expression calm, but sharp. We're going to test yours. Now. Daniel looked up, the words hitting like a weight he'd been braced for without knowing it. He nodded once, carefully. Do it. When the sample left the room, silence fell again. Daniel leaned closer to Emma, his forehead brushing lightly against the edge of her small hand. Hold on, he murmured, the words barely sound. It felt like the sound cut through water. Dr. Black's face wasn't neutral anymore. There was a tightness around his eyes that looked almost like relief. It's a match, he said. Your immune profile. It's strong enough. We can transfer cells, but it has to happen now.